She doesn't, you don't want to abandon your piece. But there are artists who do abandon their pieces, and I don't think they're irresponsible. It's just the nature of the way they work. When I was a student a long, long time ago, my teacher was Charles Kajori, and he knew Jack Youngerman, and Youngerman came to him one day and said, hey Charles, I got a bunch of big canvases. Do you want them? They're slightly used. You know, right? And he said, what am I going to do with the used canvas, right? Because Youngerman, if you know his work, that was what we call one-shot painting. It was not, he didn't overpaint and underpaint. He either hit it or he didn't. So if he didn't, it wound up in the garbage or in Kajori's studio. So I don't think it was irresponsible. That's just like the nature he worked, and myself also, and some other artists. That's the nature of your work. You take it down the road, and when you reach the end of the road, if it's just not there, you got to throw it out. So I just wanted to raise that issue. I don't think it's necessarily irresponsible to abandon a work. You know, it's not like abandoning a child.
But that must be a question you return to as things sit in the studio for months, and you haven't reached a point where you're making a move to take it to the next whatever addition or adjustment.
Yeah, that sounded pretty strange.
So that sense of abandonment is kind of always there. They're waiting.
No, I never. It's actually waiting for me. It's not abandonment.
This is what I was trying to say in a different way. Was that there's an ever-present sense that you would not abandon. They are there waiting to be returned to. Waiting to be tended.
I don't know, abandoning a painting or not abandoning a painting. I abandon nothing. I'm ready for a drawings. I just work them until they're nearly in the dirt, and somehow I put something on it, and it kind of goes from death to some kind of life again. The paper has to be falling. I mean, in a drawing, the paper has to be falling to pieces for you to abandon it. It really has to be shredded. In a painting, I don't know. Maybe I have this ridiculous idea of failure. I don't want. Maybe I have a relationship to time, and that all the time spent on this painting is just going to be ridiculous. I spent so much time on this painting, I'm not going to abandon it now. Even if all the time I spent on it is good for other paintings or other works, I want to bring this painting, each work through. I know there's something in there that if I don't like it today, I may like it tomorrow. And that there's works I've done that I think are awful today, and next I think they're quite good, and then the day after I think they're awful again. So,
but that may be due to the nature of the way you work. You have a very additive way, process of working. Again, if somebody like maybe Helen Frankenthaler, I don't know, maybe she did abandon pieces because she wanted like a very lightness in almost like a watercolor. You know, when you're working with watercolor, it's the same kind of a thing. You can't really overpaint too much. You either get it or you don't. So when I think of like Frankenthaler, I imagine that she would abandon some pieces because that's the nature of the way she was working. If somebody's working very additive, why should they abandon?
But then again, you get Matisse who worked for months on a painting because he made it in an hour sometimes. Just because he just washed them down. I remember when he had done the day before, or the hour before, and repainted exactly the same painting with a different stroke in it.
Or Picasso.
Well, I don't know, Picasso actually wiped things off. He actually was an additive painter. His paintings are layered. They're very layered. His process in drawing was about his etching was different. But he would actually remove and add. But his painting was about adding.
And maybe he was just so good he didn't have to abandon it.
No, I've been reading this book by Brassai, and Brassai was talking about a painting he had done of his close ally, and he had painted him when he was younger, and then he decided to paint, and then 10 years later he brought out a painting and it completely changed. And so here it is, it's finished. It took him 10 years to repaint the painting. Maybe it's just because it had yellow, maybe because it had cracks, I don't know. Yeah. Maybe he thought that the paint looked awful. And he decided that, he decided to repaint it.
So what about you, Paul? Have you ever taken a painting that you've let out into the world and then gotten it back? Have you ever gone and changed it again?
Yeah, I have.
I think that's an interesting process of letting something out into the world, having it come back, and then sit it around and say, no, 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 you're going to change?
It's like recycling. You can't use, you see it and you think, oh, I've got to work on that because it doesn't look good anymore.
Something's missing.
And some painters, this new artist called Porfirio Didona. So, and I knew him very well. And one day, he just piled up probably like 20, 30 paintings on the sidewalk.
Oh.
He just burned it.
Who was this?
Porfirio Didona.
Porfirio Didona. He passed away some time ago.
Well, they say that Mondrian, when he abandoned a painting, he didn't want somebody to grab it.
That's
Right.
good.
So he would get out his Luger and shoot it.
Yeah.
I don't know if that's true, but that's what I
Today would have been very
That's worse than abandoning, that's killing it.
Carry artists.
He killed his painting.
I gotta get a gun.
Baldessari, what he put in the crematory, and he actually brought it to all his oil paintings before he switched to what he did in the 60s and 70s. He went to a crematorium and had them put in there, all of them, one by one, placed in this
Wow.
burned like bodies. Yeah. But that's interesting to me. Like, I never thought I've abandoned lots of work, and I found like if you're doing it, it feels like someone's taking away from like an energy, and I have to build it back up, and it takes like a couple of months to get back at that level. So I found it really interesting that both of you don't abandon the work, because I imagine that's an interesting idea. Like, why not do that? Because then, do you feel, the reason question to bring that out more is, do you feel that that gives you an inertia to continue making more of that kind of thing? I find when I start something and then it's either too ambitious or too something, and I don't finish it, it takes away energy from me. It's harder for me to then make the next work. That's why I thought it was interesting to me, that question. Or your answer to that was interesting to me as like a potential way of going forward.
Maybe it's because if you're a performance artist, your work is about a moment in time. I mean, it's not only about that, but it's a moment in time. You can't go back on that moment. It's done. You can actually maybe abandon the performance, but well, for me anyway, the painting isn't a performance. It's about a layering of time. Every mark of that painting, if you can't see it anymore, still is part of the time that it's making. So the painting is about time, stopped layer of time. And then when it's finished, that layer of time is omnipresent in the painting. Well, if you get a dancer or a performance artist, that time is a linear time, it's a moment in time that will be remembered. So the abandoning of a painting, it becomes like you enter the world of performance perhaps. That the object is kind of, that's the performance of abandoning it. But I personally am very materialist in many ways. Although I believe in the mental space in the painting. When the painting is this object, I respect its I don't not that respect it, but its materiality interests me. And the idea of painting can go through the idea of death, that it gets to the point when it's totally dead.
You're saying the idea
Of the painting, it dies. It can die on you. The painting can die.
And you can resuscitate it.
Well, you don't resuscitate it. It goes for the moment of death, and then it becomes. Maybe it's out of metamorphosis. Metamorphosis through death into something else. It's maybe a bit esoteric, but I'm not thinking in an esoteric way. I think a work of art has to live. By, when somebody sees it, they're not in front of a dead object, they're in front of an object that has a life in it.
Right.
And that's why I think some paintings, if they aren't successful, they're never successful until they're finished for me. They're dead.
Right.
They have an early life, which is very enjoyable, back to enjoyment. And people say, oh, leave it like that. Leave it like that? You crazy? It's going to die in any minute.
I like the refer sometimes to Robert Phillips to the Cadere Steve. which remind me a lot of stories, but he had this whole principle of equivalency. The thing was really well done, not done at all, and badly done. And he said when it's not done, there is a higher potential, for sure, because nobody can judge it, you didn't make it yet. So all the ingredients are building up in your head, and you do whatever you want, whenever you want to do it. As long as you hold the idea, that's pretty much good enough, I guess, right? So you have this equivalency of, principle of equivalency. Not done at all, it's much better than well done. In that sense.
Paul, I think that raises two questions. One is, do you ever finish a painting like really quickly? Do you ever do it in just 2 layers?
Recently I have been, on my smaller paintings, I have actually worked on an idea just to see if I can actually do a painting faster than I thought I could. And last January I did do actually quite a few small ones, and some did succeed, and most of them didn't.
And the other question is, like, do you ever have a very strict procedure for how the painting is going to be made? Like, do you decide what moves you're going to make before you make them? Or does it just happen?
It kind of just happens. And actually, the paintings I did, which do seem to stay alive, I do sometimes, and the small ones do leave them. And if they do die on me, I just go back into them. That's funny, you think a painting dies on you, you look at the rest of the room, that painting just died on you. One morning you wake up and say, oh, that painting's dead. And you have to go back into it because it just died on you. And there are paintings on my wall that hang there for months. And I think, oh, that's a nice painting. And one morning I wake up, it's gone. I realize it just deceased. And I have to do something to it to bring it, to give it a longer life. Because I think there's a certain lifespans, and the longer the painting can live, the more interesting it is, and the more it brings you back into it. If it no longer brings you back into it, that means it doesn't have any lifespan.
So what creates that longevity or like the finishedness for you? And it's like an open question to everyone here. You were saying that like when a painting is sort of a certain state, it has this sort of young life to it, right? But it's not, when you were talking about early on in the painting, someone comes in the studio and says, oh, leave it like that, which is an annoying kind of thing that people say sometimes when they come in the studio. And then they're like, we're really going to keep going with it, because they're projecting their own fear about going forward, their life or something is right now in a certain place. But it's not your intention, right? I'm just reiterating what you're saying and adding a little bit.
But what happens when someone comes into the studio?
Right.
I don't listen to them.
Yeah.
I don't listen to them.
Right.
I watch their bodies.
Right.
I watch how the bodies fit into the painting.
Yeah. Meaning how their
body
language.
Their body language. I look at their body language. I see how the painting actually is not affecting them intellectually, but how the body lives around the painting. Or the painting lives on the body. Actually, it's all the way around, in fact. And I can see, because the human body is quite well proportioned. I mean, there's nothing to do with beauty. It's just it's just fantastic. The human body is. And if the painting kind of fits the human body, and the bodies move in a way that, something's happening in this painting. That's not going to make me decide if the painting's good or not. It's going to help me see the painting. They put, when people come into my studio, actually they put between me and the painting a separation, and it separates me from the painting. It's like putting someone in front of a painting helps you get out of the painting and see your painting more clearly.
Right. Yes. I see.
It's like this kind of.
And to get to the marrow of the question I was trying to ask, or wanted to ask, was like the metaphor you brought up, which is a common metaphor, and I think it's a really good one, was the idea of life. Like you make something with your hands, and artwork often has attached with this idea of it being alive. Like you have somehow put something by your touch, by your thought, or whatever, into an object, and that is either carried through a formal device or something else, an emotion, and that's or a thought, or whatever that's inside that artwork. And it's not necessarily always so concrete, whether a metaphor or something beyond metaphor. that metaphor speaks to someone else when they look at it, like the audience, as well as you. The more powerful that metaphor is expressed of life or whatever that is within it, the more alive you say that artwork is. We use that unconsciously when we're talking about it. So I guess my question is, Rothko would say, it relates to this idea about like whether something is finished and then alive and not. Rothko would say that, he said once, like cold eyes on my artwork can kill a painting. And he would say like he didn't like having sort of people in the studio or when someone's in the museum sort of neglected by a viewer. He felt like the work almost died by its neglect or someone looking at it with unfeeling eyes or something. So this idea of the permanence of life within an artwork is sort of subjective and also contingent on how people view the painting or view the photograph is interesting. How do you guys feel about that? Is it when something is made, is it stuck in this notion of alive, not alive? When does it die?
I think that's an interesting point, and that I want to throw in a little curveball, maybe thought, which is how do you think about art criticism? How do you think about people who always want to know what your work is about? And I'm reminded of going to Montreal when Natalia Nestorova, whose painting is up there, the beach scene. Natalia is a Russian artist who was invited to have a retrospective at the Musée des Beaux-Arts in Montreal. And she spoke very little English. And we went up and there was a press conference for the opening, and she was a bit overwhelmed by all this. And the people were coming with microphones. Well, tell us what your work is about. And she had the presence of mind to say, my work is about what you see. And of course, they were befuddled and perplexed and irritated because they wanted her to tell them what they were seeing. And if we think about museums today, quite often when you go to a museum, most of the people who will be around you will have on earphones and they'll be reading wall panels, and you almost feel that they are not allowed to decide what they're seeing or what they like, but they're being told and they're being, lectured about what they're seeing and why they should enjoy it and so on. So I think that I didn't mean to steal your question, but it reminded me of this whole idea of kind of whether or not critics allow people to see art on their own terms or whether they can see it at all.
How about curators?
What?
Curators,
Yeah.
not just critics.
Right.
Sometimes you have the artist to progress in the meantime, because the artist is probably not necessarily the first to be his first critic, bring his own criticism. So having somebody outside, which on an intellectual level or whatever, emotional level, can bring to another level, I think it's interesting to at least take the risk for an artist to see if there is many possibilities that you never thought about, sorted out that way.
But you also have to acknowledge there's an industry within the art community of consultants telling potential buyers what they should buy. That art collector has not even seen the art, but he or she is relying on this person who claims to be an art consultant who will tell them what to see and what to buy. Mm-hmm. And that removes the art-loving situation from the interaction between a human being and the art itself. If there's a third person telling you and just giving you all the senses as to what you should do and feel and how you emote to or react to a particular art piece, and that's a dilemma for me in this day and age.
I think it hasn't changed.
No.
It's always been the same.
You think what hasn't changed?
I think it's always been the same. I think they've always been.
You go back to Frick or Mellon or Pierre.
They
Frick told you what to think about.
No.